Ghost in the New York City by A Shark's Reading Glasses on AO3. Chapter 12. Something Strange on Bleecker Street. Wade watched from the laundry room as Danny checked away on Peter's laptop, huddled underneath a mountain of blankets on the couch, before turning back inside to finish his load of washing. This was the fifth load Wade had started, but it was better than trying to get all his shit cleaned at the laundromat, and it gave him an excuse to check up on the kid. Ever since their late-night talk 2 days ago, it was like Danny had taken one giant emotional step back from both Peter and Wade. Don't get him wrong. Danny was still as affectionate as a puppy and as clingy as a leech, and Wade meant that in the nicest way possible. But he didn't talk anymore. Sure, he still answered their questions, and still cooed at Fido when Danny thought they weren't looking. But that was it. Danny had stopped trying to make conversation or spouting his random thoughts, had stopped getting back at Wade by playing ridiculous pranks, and had gone back at picking at his food. It was like meeting the kid for the first time all over again. Only this time, it wasn't trust that was holding Danny back. It was fear. Danny was afraid of something, and it was driving both him and Peter nuts. Wade didn't even think Danny knew he was doing it. It was sort of like a mixture between his and Peter's depressive moods, which was a nightmare to think about. When Wade was depressed, he pushed everyone away to be alone and struggled not to put a bullet between his own eyes. Peter liked to go all silent and brooding, remembering things he lost, people he couldn't save. Danny was an unfortunate mixture of both. But Wade was grateful he seemed to lean towards Peter's broody, self-reflective tendencies than his own trigger-happy ones. And nothing they did seem to help, which was the worst. Danny had turned down Peter's tentative offer to patrol with him tonight, and even snuggling with Fido hadn't made a dent in the kid's mood. Fido had taken to curling around Danny in a consistent comfort. "You don't think it's a girlfriend? Or maybe a boyfriend?" Violet piped up, and Wade stilled in disbelief as he sorted his extra suit and gloves from his regular clothes. "Kids are usually terrified about that, right?" "You," Green hissed incredulously, "are a waste of headspace. I'm ashamed to share the same plane of existence with you." Violet gasped intently. "Whatever it is," Red countered, "it's eating the kid up. A lot." "You all should have been drowned at birth if you can't figure this out," Whitey mocked. "It's obviously his ghost powers." "Fools!" Greenie screeched over all of them, and Wade flinched at the volume. "Imbeciles! Morons! It's right in front of your faces!" "Put a sock in it, Green Bean," Yellow sighed. "Not everyone likes to read ahead." All the boxes started to shout over one another, and Wade slammed his hand down on the dryer to quiet them. "Shut up," Wade growled harshly, throwing an unmatched sock into the correct pile. "I can't even hear myself think with y'all yakking away in my ear." "Wade?" Danny asked from the living room, and Wade jolted. "Are you okay?" "I'm all good, Homeslice," Wade assured him. "I just stumped my toe. Washer jumped right at me. Keep your hands to yourself the next time you come here." Wade held his breath as Danny paused. "All right," Danny replied slowly, not even a hint of a chuckle, as he went back to brooding, which, rude, Wade's jokes were amazeballs. And Wade sighed. He thought Peter might have mentioned the boxes to Danny before, but he hadn't had a full breakdown episode in front of the kid yet, and he wanted to keep it that way. As he prepared to finish separating his clothes, he let the gears turn in his head. His instincts were leaning towards Whitey's theory. Whitey scoffed. "Obviously." But he also agreed with Greenie that it was probably more than that, and he struggled to think of what it could be. Maybe he's guilty about something, Wade thought. Something about his ghost powers that make him uncomfortable? And he remembered what Danny had told him and Peter when they were preparing for their fight with Platimus. Vlad is considered half by other ghosts, but he's more ghostly than I am, Danny answered as he shivered. I just don't. I don't want to let go of a part of my humanity to be a stronger ghost because I know what kind of a monster it'll make me if I do. I'm scared if I develop an obsession, I'll be more ghost than human.
Fucking finally!
Greenie shouted.
Now we're getting somewhere.
Wade pondered as he grabbed the pile of his clothes and strolled down the hallway into Peter's room to put them in the duffel bag. The boxes were silent as Wade finished stuffing his duffel, filling away a few switchblades and a handgun or two beneath his clothes.
You don't think he's killed anyone because of his obsession, do you?
Red wondered and Wade froze. Danny had told them that ghosts were compelled to fulfill their obsessions, sometimes using violence if they had to. And while Wade wouldn't really care that much if Danny had killed someone, he himself had over 100 confirmed kills and counting. Who was he to judge? Hell, Peter probably wouldn't care that much if Danny just gave them both a good reason. Wade knew that with Danny's level of goodness, something like that would tear him up inside. Wade bit his lip as he exited Peter's room and wandered back down the hall, peeking over at Danny from the kitchen door frame. The kid was snuggled up on the sofa, Fiddle curled on top of his head, and continuously purring into Danny's hair. There was another problem. Since Danny's nightmare, the kid couldn't seem to get warm, as in Peter's level of spider mutation made it impossible to thermoregulate kind of fuckery. Danny shivered constantly now, even when sitting next to the heater or under an electric blanket. It had kicked Peter into overdrive when he first noticed it, worried that Danny had somehow gotten sick, but the kid wasn't running a temp, or at least one in the right direction. Danny hadn't been getting chills from a fever. He was shivering because he was actually cold. It had honestly thrown Peter for a loop, and Wade had semi-joked that maybe it was a ghost flu. Danny had just shrugged, listlessly, too emotionally drained to care. The ghostly fever had worried Wade a little bit too, but what the hell is he gonna do? The only relief Danny seemed to be getting was when he changed into his ghost form, so he had been switching between them for the past 2 days, when he couldn't stand the cold. Speaking of which, maybe Wade could. Hey, home slice? Wade called out from the kitchen, and Danny's head popped out from the mountains of blankets, Fido rising along with him as Danny peered over the back of the sofa. Why don't you try playing with Fido for a bit? They're starting to look a little round, don't you think? As soon as the word play left his mouth, Fido jumped from Danny's head onto the air in excited whistles and clicks, flying compliant circles around Danny's head. The kid rolled his eyes. They're a shade, Wade, Danny groaned, attempting to burrow back into his blanket fortress of solitude. They're supposed to look like that, and it's training. Training. Oopsie, my mistake. Wade grinned slyly as Fido dove back after Danny, chirping insistently in his ear and tugging him back out of the blankets. Fido looks like they're already decided, though. Better get to it, Skirt. Chop chop. Danny turned his head to glare at him, but it slowly melted into a small grin. Yeah, okay. Danny agreed, facing out of his warm cocoon and shivering as he sat crisscross on the floor behind the sofa. He changed forms and started trailing his ectocharge's fingers through the air as Fido chased after them. Wade watched for a little bit as the kid's mood seemed to get better the longer they played, trained, and he turned into the kitchen to start lunch with a tiny fist bump. Nailed it, Wade thought, as he rummaged around the cabinets for something to eat. That was the happiest he'd seen Danny since his nightmare, and Wade wasn't about to kick a gift horse, shade, ghost horse, in the mouth. He found some cans of soup in one of the cabinets and decided, screw it. He may not be as good of a cook as Peter, but he could manage tomato soup and grilled cheese, right?
Doubtful.
Whiny laughed, and Wade gave the box an equivalent of the middle finger. He put the tomato soup to simmer in a pot on the stove and started toasting slices of bread for the grilled cheese in a frying pan, adding bits of meat to the sandwiches for variety. As the bread goldened and the cheese melted, Wade went back to try and think of the best way to bring up the topic with Danny, and he got his lip. Subtlety wasn't really his thing, and Wade wasn't going to force the problem out in the open, not if Danny wasn't comfortable talking about it. Peter would probably know a better way to broach the issue with the kid, so he would just have to wait until Peter got home from the Daily Bugle to talk to him. Wade turned off the stove, pouring the soup into 2 bowls, and put the grilled cheese on separate plates. The soup was a little lumpy, and one of the sandwiches was a bit burnt, but that didn't matter. In your face, Peter and Whitey. Wade could totally cook something besides pancakes. He began looking for a tray to bring out onto the living room so Danny could eat his lunch in a pile of blankets when Wade noticed something weird. He was cold, like skin prickled with goosebumps, teeth shattering and shivering kind of cold. Visible steam was plummeting off the soup and sandwiches. Wade's breath fogged out in front of him with each exhale.
3 guesses as to where this could be coming from,
Greenie sung, sturdily.
and the first 2 don't count.
Son of a bitch. Wade abandoned lunch in the kitchen and dashed towards the living room. He skidded to a stop just as he reached the front of the hallway and let his mouth hang open. The air in the living room was much colder than the kitchen. In the back of the sofa, a small circle of floor around Danny was painted in frost. Danny seemed to be oblivious in the frozen remake he was enhancing behind him, too distracted by squishing Fido's face gently between his hands to notice. Wade tried to school his expression so Danny wouldn't panic, but whoopsie! Danny's eyes snapped over to him and he stilled, letting Fido drop from his hand. What? Danny asked anxiously, and he noticed how Wade's attention was fixed on the sofa behind him while Fido trilled curiously, mouthing at Danny's fingers. Danny raised his eyebrows and turned to look. Wait a second, kid. Wade tried to stall, but as soon as Danny saw the frost trailing up the couch and crawling further along the floor, he went pale and jumped on his feet. Fido slipped into the air, letting out a distressed whistle as Danny took a few steps backwards and left frosted footprints in his wake. With each step he took, Danny looked more anxious and panicked, jolting when he backed himself into the back right corner of the living room by the balcony. Frost blooming out from where Danny's back met the corner, speedily creeping along the wall, floor, and balcony window in his fear and confusion. Wade, Danny shouted, petrified. Wade, I'm not trying to do this. Fido sipped unhappily over both their heads, whining and concerned. Hey, Wade said nervously, following Danny into the corner. Hey, home slice, look at me. You're fine. Wade took another step closer, and Danny flinched, tucking his hands close to his body. No, don't! Danny told him, fearfully, curling in on himself in the frost inched further along the balcony window. I don't want to hurt you. Healing factor, Wade reminded him cockily, taking another step closer so he was an arm's length away from Danny and ignored the frost on the floor boards underneath his bare feet. You couldn't hurt me if you tried, kid. Just because you have a healing factor doesn't mean you can't feel pain, Danny argued stubbornly, his breath starting to hitch and, oh, shit. Danny could not have a panic attack right now. Frostbite ain't so bad, Wade responded. The regeneration makes it feel all tingly like pins and needles when your arm falls asleep, but kid, I need you to try to relax, okay? Panicking is only going to make it worse. I'm trying, Danny gasps, clenching his hands into the jumpsuit on his arms while another layer of frost crawled along the wall. Just take a deep breath, Wade returned, and chill out. Everything stilled. I can't believe you just said that, Violet gushed. That was perfect. Shut up, Wade snapped, because fuck a duck, that actually seemed to work. Danny's shoulders shook as he tried to stifle a hysterical giggle, and even Fido stopped whining to let out a hiccup of laughter. I guess I'm on some thin ice, huh? Danny wheezed out between grimace chuckles, and Wade grinned. I see what you did there, but that was kind of an eyesore, Wade countered, scooching an inch closer to Danny. Don't I know it? Danny retited, his breath still hitching slightly, but he wasn't one word away from a panic attack anymore. It's a frustrating situation. Well, melt, Wade retorted, then gestured to himself. But you can't hold a candle to all this. Danny outright laughed at that one, unclenching his hands and lowering his arms to the side. That was a good one, Danny shot back, straining up against the wall. Got any others? Asking thy friend. Wade rolled his eyes. Weak, but I'll let it slide. Wade snickered, and Danny smiled feebly back as the frost began to slow. All good, home slice? Could be better, Danny bit out. His focus flickered between Wade and the eyes starting to form on the walls. Wade moved closer, getting Danny to focus solely on him, as Fiddle chirped nervously behind him. Hey, you okay? Wade reminded, glad that he had decided to stay in his thick sweater and sweatpants for the morning. Even with those, he could feel a chill radiating off of Danny and creeping past his clothes. I don't know what's going on, Danny remarked, trembling. It's fine, kid, Wade replied, slowly reaching out a hand to put on Danny's shoulder. As soon as his hand touched down, frost started to warm its way back up Wade's fingers. He had to bite his tongue to smother a gasp because, damn, it was like he dunked his hand in a bucket of ice water. Once Wade knew it was safe, though, he wouldn't traumatize Danny by freezing his fingers off or something. He brought his other hand to Danny's shoulder and started rubbing them in comfort. See, Squirt? Totally all right. Danny exhaled in relief, relaxing in Wade's hold. Fido took that as a cue to come closer, plopping themselves on Wade's shoulder and cued something at Danny. Wade, I'm a little freaked out right now, Danny admitted quietly as he continued to tremble. Wade's heart ached. This has never happened to me before. I mean, I'm used to getting new powers every once in a while, but none of them have been ever this out of control. I don't know, what should I do? Wade gasped a little. Wade wasn't exactly the brightest bull in the box. Sure, he knew military tactics, could improvise plans on the fly, memorized about 50 of his favorite gun types and brands so he could dismantle and reload them by the touch alone, could read body language to tell if someone was going to dick him over, and was captain of making a bomb if he needed to. But he had never had anyone look to him for guidance, and it was sort of terrifying, filling him with the same sort of dread as the idea of people thinking of him as a hero. Oh man, the fuck up, Whitey growled and Wade swallowed. How about no? Let's totally say we did, Wade thought. Come on, Yellow piped up. Can't be that hard. This whole winter wonderland started when he changed forms, idiot, Green reminded him, and an idea clicked into place. Try changing back, Wade suggested as gently as he could, while Frost started moving past his fingers and trailed up his arms. You said it's harder to access your ghost powers when you're in your normal form. Danny nodded enthusiastically, closing his eyes in concentration. A white ring of electricity flickered into existence around Danny's abdomen and hovered there for a moment as Danny's brows furrowed. Wade lifted his hands off of Danny's shoulders as Danny absent-mindedly brought one of his own hands to his chest to clench at the jumpsuit. The light produced by the ring brightened, then split into two rings as they moved across Danny's body, changing him back. When Danny was completely transformed, he let out a shudder exhale, and his body already started to shiver. Wade noticed that he was shivering a lot harder than he normally was from the past 2 days, and Danny's lips were turning blue. If there was one thing that Wade was good at, it was knowing that he was in over his head. They needed Peter now. Peter raced along the sidewalk back to his apartment, his camera bag secured tightly under his arms as he weaved past people, occasionally giving out rushed apologies when he bumped into someone. Peter had always been grateful to find an apartment that was close enough to the Daily Bugle that he could walk, but he'd never been more thankful than now. Wade had called him on his cell the last 2 hours of his shift, and at first Peter had been wary about answering it. Wade usually preferred texting him during the day if he wanted to talk, only calling if he was particularly lonely, and really wanted, and needed, some company. Peter had answered the call hesitantly, but as soon as he heard Wade say Danny's name, he was standing out of his chair, logging out of his work computer, and gathering his things. He had split his phone into his pocket as he made his way to JJ's office, opening the door without even knocking. Peter, JJ had barked, lifting his head from the section of print he was proofreading. What are you? I need to go, Peter told him without preamble. Family emergency. I'll make up my hours next week. Wait, now, just a minute, JJ shouted at him as he stood up behind his desk and crossed his arms. It's always a family emergency with you, isn't it, Peter? What is it this time? Your dog pissed on your carpets? Something with your aunt? Did you forget to turn off the stove? Peter saw red, and he clenched his hands into a fist. My kid's sick, all right? Peter fumed, and he could see in his peripheral a number of people turning their head towards the commotion. Is that good enough for you, JJ? My kid is sick, and he's getting worse. Feeling particularly brave and fed up with JJ's bullshit, Peter added, so either fire me, or I can sue you for harassment, or take it out of my vacation hours because I'm leaving. My kid needs me. Peter slammed the door closed and marched briskly out of the office, more than a few other employees following him with his eyes as he left. Peter hadn't bothered getting into his Spider-Man suit so he could web to the apartment. It would have taken too long to find a secluded enough place to change, and it was early enough in the day that someone could spot him trying to get in through the balcony or the fire escape. So he stuck to the streets, cutting his time down by slipping through back alleys and darting between backed-up traffic. He made it up the stairs, halfway up the building, and his spidey senses inevitably pringled and danced along his back, and he switched to taking 3 stairs at a time. He didn't stop moving until he was finally inside his apartment. When he went through the front door, it was like stepping into a wall of hot air. The heat, obviously cranked up a few degrees. Danny was sitting on the far end of the couch under a mountain of blankets that had been left there since his morning. He was wearing Wade's hoodie over his PJs and one of Peter's scarves around his neck with a cup of tea cradled in his hands. The electric blanket Peter had pulled out yesterday was turned on high, and an empty bowl of soup and a thermos lay discarded on the coffee table. Even with all that extra heat, Danny still shivered, his teeth clattering, and his lips were tinted an alarming shade of blue. Wade was standing next to Danny on the couch, still in his sweatpants and sweater. One of his arms was around Danny's shoulder so he could tuck Danny into his side and share some of his body heat, while Fiddle was nestled into the crook of Wade's neck. The rest of the living room was a bit of a disaster. There were random puddles of water and sloppy towels all over the floor, mostly behind the couch and in the corner of the balcony. The balcony windows were covered in a melting sheet of ice, adding to the mess. It looked like Wade had attempted to clean up the water, but had decided to stop halfway to stay with Danny on the couch. Peter shedded his coat, camera bag, and shoes at the door, not even bothering to hang them up as he rushed to kneel in front of Danny so they were eye level with each other. "Hey, Danny," Peter spoke softly. "Hey, Peter," Danny replied, bringing his mug to his lips to take a sip of hot tea. Peter brushed Danny's bang to the side so he could lay the back of his hand across Danny's forehead. Danny's skin was like ice, and Peter's heart hammered. "What's his temperature?" Peter requested, turning to Wade. 89 degrees. Wade grimaced, rubbing his hands on Danny's arm underneath the blanket to generate heat. And Fido whistled from a spot on Wade's neck. Peter blinked in horrified shock and gasped. 89. That's... How is he moderately hymophobic? How long has he been like this? Peter demanded, taking his hand away from Danny's forehead. "I just wanted to stop feeling cold for a little while," Danny piped up, miserably. "So I changed into my ghost form to train with Fido for a bit. It was only about 10, maybe 15 minutes, and then my powers went haywire. I didn't even notice, not until Wade came back into the room." Danny paused to take another sip of the warm tea. I was freaking out a little bit, and the frost and ice just started to cover everything I touched. Wade helped me calm down enough so I could change back, but now I'm like this." Hey, Peter hastily ensured from his position on the floor. "It's okay. I'm not mad. I promise. I'm just worried about you." Danny nodded in understanding, curling tighter into Wade's side. "He's been like this since a little before I called you, so nearly 10 minutes, Wade remarked, as the blankets around Danny quivered as another bout of shiver began. "And it's getting lower." "Lower?" Peter exclaimed as he jumped up. He put his hands to run through his hair as he started to pace. We have to take him to the hospital," Peter decided, starting to make his way back to the door for his coat when Danny reached out and grabbed his arm. "Wait, no, Peter," Danny begged, even as his teeth clattered and he desperately tried to stay under the blankets. "I think it's something wrong with my core. It hurts when I try to change back. Going to the hospital won't help." "Maybe not," Peter argued, tucking Danny back under the blankets. "But they'll have better equipment to treat hypothermia, long enough that we could figure out what's going on." "Please, Peter," Danny pleaded, his eyes beginning to shimmer. "If I go to the hospital, they'll call my parents. You and Wade could get in trouble." Peter stiffened. He could probably call Matt to go with them to the hospital to explain the situation to the staff, but that would take too long. With how quickly Danny's condition was worsening, they didn't have that time that they could risk with the Fentons getting in touch with Danny. They still hadn't contacted Matt and Foggy, and both lawyers had mentioned that they were concerned Danny's parents might try something. They couldn't risk giving them the edge if they were planning on fighting Danny's emancipation. "Damn it," Peter whispered, walking around the coffee table so he had more room to pace around the TV, rubbing frantically at his hair. Peter tried to think of what they could do. Danny definitely needed some type of medical attention, because whatever Wade was doing was only buying them time. They also needed someone who knew a little about Danny, or at least about Fenton. Peter knew Matt had a nurse friend that helped him out when he seriously got hurt, but she wouldn't have the proper equipment to help slow Danny's hypothermia, nor did she have any background about ghosts. But there was one person who might. Peter froze, dropping his hands out from his hair. He dug out his phone from his pocket, dialing the number by heart, and began pacing again. Pick up, Peter murmured frantically, bringing his other hand to his face to bite his thumbnail. When the line connected, Peter felt like he wanted to collapse in relief. "Genius Billionaire Hotline," Mr. Stark answered, his tone light and tense. "What's up, Spiderling?" "Mr. Stark, Tony." Peter stuttered, and he could almost picture how Mr. Stark would perk up in alarm. Peter only ever called him Tony when things were serious. It's Phantom. His powers went haywire for some reason, and he's been hyperthermic for nearly 10 minutes. Friday, initiate lockdown procedure for the lab, level 4. Mr. Stark snapped, and Peter could hear the sounds of tools being dropped on the table as Mr. Stark abandoned his current project. Save the current documents and bring them up to Phantom's file, and any readings we kept from his visit. Peter, start from the beginning. 2 days ago, Phantom started to feel perceptibly cold in his normal form. Peter began telling him, but Mr. Stark cut him off. I'm sorry, his what? Mr. Stark interrupted, confused. Phantom's a hybrid, Peter informed him, somewhat annoyed. He could change forms. He has a ghost form and a human form. He's been switching between them for short periods of relief, but about 15 minutes ago, some of his powers went out of control. We don't know why, but when he switched back, his temperature fell to 89 degrees and is still dropping. Okay, Mr. Stark crossed, his fingers tapping against the holographic computer screen. Ignoring, for now, the fact that somehow a kid is both alive and dead at the same time, I think I've seen something similar before. When he was here, Phantom agreed to some testing, and there was a series of temperature spikes and valleys, but he didn't seem to notice them happening. He said this began 2 days ago, and his temperature never rose at all during that time. I'm not 100% sure, Peter told him, pacing some more. But I don't think so, no. Damn it, Mr. Stark murmured. Then it's something else. Friday, start searching through all Phantom's research. Look for studies that mention ecto-entities, long periods of extreme cold temperatures, and or anything that might disrupt a ghost's power. Right away, boss. Friday intoned, primed, and Peter straightened up. Also, look into anything that mentions ghost cores, Peter quickly added as he stilled. Phantom said he felt something wrong with his core when he changed back. Parameter added. Friday anticipated. Updating research search. That's my girl, Mr. Stark praised, while beginning to browse through the research, permissing some and keeping others while turning his attention back to Peter. In the meantime, what are you doing right now for Phantom? The heat's turned up in the apartment. We've got him in warm clothes. He's under a few quilts and electric blanket. He's been drinking warm fluids, Peter listed, trending a path in the carpet. But that's just slowing whatever this is down. It's not helping. And you want to bring him here? Mr. Stark asked, a little skeptically. You'll have better equipment to treat hyperthermia and monitor his condition, Peter explained, gesturing with his hands. And as soon as we figure out what's going on, we can treat him there. I don't think that's going to work, Mr. Stark said lightly, and Peter stalled. Why not? Peter cried out. Pete, I may be a genius, but I'm not a doctor, Mr. Stark reminded him. You have multiple doctorates, Peter rebutted, and Mr. Stark made a noise of frustration. In mechanical engineering, software design, and a minor in chemistry, Mr. Stark yelled. The most I know about human anatomy is basic first aid. Bring him here would be too much time, and even if we did, I'm not exactly an expert in ectology. Pete, most of the stuff in these papers just doesn't make any physical goddamn sense. And the stuff that does, I can barely wrap my own head around. And not only that, the research is only a few years old. It could be completely wrong for all we know. Not to mention, we don't know if any of this can be added to Phantom because he's a hybrid. Tony, there has to be something we can do, Peter insisted, and Mr. Stark paused. Have you talked to his parents? Mr. Stark questioned carefully, and Peter froze, and his brain stalled. What are you talking about? Peter whispered. Peter, you and I both know I'm smart enough to figure out who Phantom is, Mr. Stark responded, both exaggerated and apologetic. His parents are the only certified ghost experts in the world right now. They might be able to help. No, Peter denied as he started pacing again. No way in hell. I know you mentioned that he's having difficulties with them, Mr. Stark continued, and Peter gritted his teeth. Whatever's going on can't be more important than his life. They shot him, Tony! Peter yelled into the phone, and he saw Danny, Wade, and Fiddle flinch on the couch, while Mr. Stark went dead silent. When he tried to tell them about his powers, they shot him. I'm trying to get him emancipated so he could feel safe again, and I'm not about to give them an edge if they decide to put up a fight. They are never hurting him again. All right, Mr. Stark correlated after a moment. I didn't know. I'm sorry. Peeler swallowed down his anger and laid out a long exhale. I know, Peter acknowledged quietly. I'm sorry, too. What about the results? Do you have anything? Yeah, Mr. Stark returned, tactfully accepting Peter's change in topic. But it's nothing good. Strategies of ecto-energy core destabilization is the closest thing I could find. Peter's heart stuttered. Core destabilization? He echoed, and Danny instantly paled while Fiddle whined and ducked behind Wade's shoulder. What the hell is that? According to the Fenton research, a ghost core is circulum of a ghost's being and energy, identity, as well as their power source, Mr. Stark answered, humbling slightly as he browsed through the article. They list reasons for cores to destabilize, which then leads to... To what? Peter needed instantly. Core destabilization usually leads to complete elimination of the ecto entity. Friday finished for him somberly, and Peter's breath hitched. The line was silent for a moment before Peter spoke again. What causes core destabilization? Peter determined. Pete, Mr. Stark tried, but Peter continued. Tony, you said it yourself. We don't know if any of those concepts could be applied to Phantom because he's a hybrid. It could be nothing. He might not. Either way, it's the only lead we've got right now. Mr. Stark quietly agreed, and rattled off to the possible clause for a core to destabilize. But none of them seemed to apply to Danny. Peter kept in mind anyways. But just as he was about to make another suggestion, Mr. Stark spoke up. There may be another way to help him, Mr. Stark stated hesitantly. Some of these concepts the Phantom discussed in the research were a bit mystical. Peter blinked. Mystical? He repeated skeptically, and Mr. Stark sighed. Don't make me say it. Mr. Stark huffed in irritation, and Peter's jaw dropped. You're talking about magic, Peter realized, and both Danny and Fido looked somewhat intrigued, while Wade slapped a hand over his ears. Oh, great, Wade moaned sourly as Danny looked between the two of them. Yes, I'm talking about magic, Mr. Stark hissed sullenly. And lucky for us, we know a wizard in New York. You really think Dr. Strange could help us? Peter complained, and Mr. Stark sighed heavily. It's the only option that's left besides going to his parents, Mr. Stark admitted. If you're serious about not involving them, this is your best shot. Peter nodded, and his heart lifting. Thanks for your help, Tony, Peter said. Keep me posted, Peter. Mr. Stark responded, and the line clicked ended. Peter pushed his phone back into his pocket and turned to face Danny, Wade, and Fido, debating what to do next. Peter knew magic was something that both Mr. Stark and Wade were extremely uncomfortable with. Mr. Stark disliked magic because it defied all nature laws and physics and science, while Wade had some terrible experience with it. They both tended to stay far away from it as possible. And while Peter saw magic as a concept he didn't quite understand, he was still very wary of it, especially because it tended to alibi his spider senses. Not only that, but Dr. Strange wasn't exactly known for warm welcomes. He and Mr. Stark had come to a tentative truce due to some disaster or another, and Peter knew him tentatively as well, but he tended to keep to himself. Peter licked his lips as a plan formed. Danny sat enraptured under his burrito of blankets, as Peter explained to him that magic, or more specifically the mystical arts, was apparently a thing, and that there was a wizard, or a master of the mystic arts, called Doctor Strange, who lived in Greenwood Village, that might be able to help. Peter proposed that because ghosts were mystical beings, in a sense, Doctor Strange would possibly be able to help Danny when science couldn't. Danny had always considered paranormal studies as another obscure science, thanks to his parents' research. But ever since his accident and experiencing the ghost zone for himself, he had begun to notice a more spiritual aspect to it as well. Even with the dire situation he was in, he couldn't help but be curious and a bit excited that he might be able to put a label on some things he previously couldn't explain about his powers. After Peter explained the basics, he suggested that he and Danny should go visit Doctor Strange himself, and Wade had protested at first, even though he was obviously uncomfortable with the idea. Eventually, Peter wore Wade down, reasoning that Doctor Strange was fairly protective and secretive of his home, and that someone should stay behind with Fido. Wade grumbly agreed, and got off the couch to call in his taxi driver. As they waited for Dopender to arrive to the apartment, Peter bustled about trying to get things ready to make the trip easier for Danny. He pushed a thermostat filled with more hot tea into Danny's hand, dug out a pair of microwavable hand warmers, and muffled them into his pockets, and lent him a thicker coat to put over Wade's jacket, making sure the hood was up when Dopender finally reached the apartment. Danny reluctantly withdrew from his nest of blankets, and after a quick goodbye to Wade and Fido, he and Peter had rushed to the taxi, and they were off. Danny squirmed, tucking himself closer to Peter as Doppelganger made another hair-raising turn, trying to keep his teeth from clattering. Well, he hadn't necessarily been comfortable under the blankets back at the apartment. Walking to the taxi in the fall afternoon had felt like treading through the Arctic tundra. Even now, with the car heater at max, Danny felt like he had laid down in a pile of snow. Peter's mouth pulled into a worry frown as he pulled out an arm around Danny's shoulder and rubbed at his sides, passing him the thermostat and urging him to take a sip. Danny took a huge gulp before passing it back, watching the city fly by through the taxi window as Doppelganger weaved through traffic and slipped past yellow lights. With Doppender driving, they managed to make it to Green Village in 20 minutes. As the car stopped and Danny exited the taxi, he took a surprised breath as his core vibrated in his chest. The building in front of him was 3 stories tall, made of red brick and lined with carved stone pillars. Each floor was filled with tall windows surrounded by an iron fence and had a few tiny balconies to walk out on. The third floor was a pair of metal-tiled roof, feathered green with age, and in the center of the roof was a large circular window decorated with a strange symbol. The mansion stuck out like a sore thumb, surrounded by gardens and other shops and restaurants, but seemed oddly secured for its location. Danny gulped as he stared at the building, trying to place the somewhat familiar feeling that washed over him. It felt similar to the ghost zone, but it had more oppressive, discouraging, unwelcoming energy to it. Danny exhaled shakily as Peter exited the car. He hoped whatever this wizard was could help him. He didn't think he could take much more of this, and the thought of contacting his parents made him nauseous. "So, this is it?" Danny asked, and Peter nodded. "This is it," Peter confirmed, roughly. One hand fiddled with the thermos. They both were silent before Danny coughed awkwardly, shuddering at the deep chill sealing back into his body. "So," Danny hesitated. "Do we just go up and knock, or what?" Peter chuckled dryly and took a step forward. Before Danny could follow him, Peter tensed and shedded Danny with his arms. A new energy washed over Danny's skin, and his body was covered in goosebumps as reality warped and crackled in front of him like a broken mirror. Peter looked around wildly, keeping Danny at his back, and Danny blinked. Nobody else was on the street seemed to notice what was happening. Danny grabbed onto Peter's back to try and get his attention when a ring of sparkling light formed on the step leading to the mansion, and a man stepped through before the ring disappeared. His dark hair was swept out of his face, and he had a neatly trimmed beard covering his chin. The man wore a strange deep blue robe under a red velvet high-collared cloak and loose dark brown pants. Circled high around his waist was a complicated leather belt, and he wore a simple boot. Around the man's neck was an amulet that looked like an ornamental eye with a green gemstone set in the middle as a pupil, and same symbol that was on the rose window on the mansion also coupled the iris. The green hue was a gemstone, and the feeling it gave off tugged at Danny's memory. He was sure he had seen the amulet like that before. His core pinged weakly as he glanced at the amulet, urging him to get closer look, but Danny decided to stay with Peter for now. The man on the stairs pierced Peter with a look and then shifted his eyes to Danny. Danny flinched and shuddered further behind Peter's back. "Parker?" the man intoned as he crossed his arms, and it sounded like a greeting, a question, and a reprimand all at once. "Dr. Strange?" Peter acknowledged, relaxing. "This is—" "I know who you brought, Parker." Dr. Strange stared critically, and both Peter and Danny jolted. "You know who I am?" Danny asked, cautiously from behind Peter. "I keep a list of beings from other realms that may be a threat to this world," Dr. Strange declared, and Danny felt his core stutter and his stomach plummet. "That boy is one of the entities on it." Peter blinked before he gulped and took a step forward. "Strange, I know Danny's ghost abilities make him powerful," Peter began gravely, "but he's sick. His core can be destabilizing, and you're one of our last options we have. Please, you have to help him." Doctor Strange stiffened before he spoke. "I can't," Doctor Strange gritted out. "Not until I know exactly what he is." Peter bristled. "He's a 15-year-old kid," Peter seethed, gesturing angrily. "And he could be dying. That should be enough for you, Doctor." Doctor Strange shriveled up, his cloak billowing onwards as he hovered a few feet off the ground. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Doctor Strange yelled, his voice booming and echoing around them as his hand sparkled and glowed. Danny's core shook. "Nor what you're asking of me. Do you know what the Scundrum scholars mean? Holy of holies. This isn't just my home, Parker. It's the resting place for thousands of magical relics and ancient tombs. The largest collection of mystical knowledge in the world. I cannot allow just any minuscule entity access to it. Not without knowing I can trust them." Peter was about to retort when Danny stepped around him and planted himself between the two of them, his hands raised and palms open. "Then test me." Danny suggested as his teeth clattered, barely keeping his arms up as they were racked with tremor. You said you don't know if you can trust me, so test me. Danny, Peter exclaimed in disbelief, but Danny held up one of his index fingers before Peter could continue, asking him to wait. Peter paused, and Danny proceeded. You don't know me, Danny told Doctor Strange through his trembling lips, and Doctor Strange stared him down. You don't trust me. I get that. So do whatever you need to, and I'll prove that I am trustworthy. Doctor Strange's eyes bored into Danny's before he lifted his hands and made a series of complicated gestures. Symbols and shapes sparked into existence, and Danny watched, enraptured, as they seamlessly woven together into a complex circle that reminded him of a ruse. Doctor Strange threw it at Danny's feet, and the circle was complete, and Danny flinched at his core spiked in anticipation as the enchantment burned itself into the pavement around him. Peter made an abrupt step forward, but otherwise clenched his fist. This spell prevents any specters with ill intentions from leaving the circle, Doctor Strange explained as he floated down the steps and touched it down in front of Danny. It doesn't just take your present thoughts into account, it perceives your past actions as well. Cross the circle, attempt any trickery, and I will know. And I won't hesitate to leave you in this dimension forever. Danny swallowed his nerves as he lowered his hands, stiffening in the edge with the glowing sigil while Peter made a sound of protest. His core was vibrating uneasily, and his hair stood on end while his shivering got worse. He couldn't afford to stall. Danny closed his eyes as he exhaled shakily, putting all his being into one thing. I'm not going to do any harm, Danny thought. I'm not going to hurt anyone. I'm not evil. I don't want to be evil. I use my powers to help my friends, save people, protect them, and I'll keep protecting them. With that last thought, he took a step forward. It felt like going under a waterfall, a weight pressuring down his entire body and his core as energy flowed around and through him. The release of pressure when he made it to the other side was like coming up for air, and the feeling made him gasp and tip slightly. The enchantment fizzled out as it slowly disappeared, bits and pieces floating up and glowing embers in a fire. Peter exhaled in relief and began to make his way around the last remnants of the spell as it dissipated. Danny turned his attention to Doctor Strange and saw he was looking at Danny in a mixture of surprise and relief. Danny was about to speak when the notice of the edges of his visions were darkening. He wobbled for a moment, then collapsed with Peter shouting of concern ringing in his ear. Danny woke up on a comfy leather couch inside a dimly lit room in front of a lit fireplace, covered in a thick quilt. The coat Peter had lent him was draped along the back of the couch, and Wade's jacket was folded in a pillow underneath his head, leaving him in his long-sleeved shirts and sweatpants. He pushed himself up while holding around the room in interest, as he unfolded Wade's jacket and shrugged it over his shoulders, feeling comfort having it on. The room was filled with oddities Danny had never seen before and couldn't even begin to name, some displayed in cases along the walls, others propped up on open tables. The familiar feeling he had when he first saw the mansion was all around him, and it nagged him at his core. The whole place felt like the ghost portal, only different, less intense. He decided to pull it out of his mind for now. Instead, relentlessing in the feeling of warmth for the first time he had in days, Danny gave himself a once-over, inspecting his body and his core. His limbs were achy, like he had just finished an intense workout. His throat was a little patched, and he was surprised to find that he was hungry. He reached down inside him, letting his core flare slightly to check in reaction. He didn't feel the core bloom like it normally did. It felt restricted, like a sprained ankle when it was stretched. Danny was about to try to change form when a voice spoke behind him. "You're awake," a man said calmly, and his speech ancient. Danny rolled around, jumping off the couch and taking a step back. The man wore robe and pants similar to Doctor Strange, only instead of blue, they were burgundy red. Rather than a complicated leather belt, he wore a simple Roth cloth and colored sash around his waist, and the leather bracer on his forearms. His black hair was buzzed short, and he had a thin mustache on his upper lip and in the center of his chin. He stood straight with his hands clasped behind his back, and regarded Danny calmly, if a bit worriedly. Danny tried to relax as he patted around the couch, gathering Peter's coat to his chest and folding it like a shield. The man stared impatiently before he spoke again. "I am Wong," he introduced stiffly, "an ally of Doctor Strange and a master of mystical arts." "Danny," he cautiously replied back, and Wong nodded curtly. "Follow me," Wong stated, and he turned around, walking briskly out the door. "I'll bring you to Doctor Strange and Mr. Peter." Danny quickly followed him, struggling slightly to keep up while he tried to take in all the strangeness in the mansion. It seemed bigger on the inside than what Danny had assumed from how it looked on the outside. It was filled with more hues and antiques that Danny had ever seen before. Wong led him through the various hallways and ended up in a single grand staircase to what Danny guessed was the middle floor, passing more relics on display. Some of them made his core buzz in excitement, and the others in anticipation. And the part of Danny that incited him to wander into his parents' portal was itching to explore. That nagging feeling of familiarity coming back, and his core urged him to leave Wong to mender on his own, complaining him to go deeper into the mansion. Danny ignored it, smart enough to know his host would be extremely displeased with his curiosity. Wong guided him to a large, personal library that was filled to the wall with shelves and packed with books of all shapes and sizes. Some were small, so they could fit in Danny's palm, while others were large in textbooks. A few that Danny could see were as thin as a spiral-bound notebook, while others were as thick as dictionaries. There were a handful of titles Danny could read, but the rest were written in languages he couldn't understand and even more that he didn't even recognize. A large oak table with 2 lamps at the end of it was stationed in the center of the room, and small towers of books were scattered across the surface. Peter and Doctor Strange were conversing tensely at one of the bookshelves, as Doctor Strange pulled out a book, flipped a few pages before putting it back and throwing it behind him. Danny watched in dazed awe as Doctor Strange's red carpet hovered in the air by itself and admittedly caught each tomb before placing it on top of the growing piles. When the croak faced Danny and Wong, it jolted in surprise before rushing over to Doctor Strange and tapping it on the shoulder with a corner of itself. Doctor Strange turned, and Peter turned with him, gasping in relief as he spotted Danny. Peter rushed over to him, gathering him in a hug that made Danny's ribs creak. "Don't ever do that to me again," Peter whispered in his hair, and Danny nodded into Peter's chest as he returned the gesture. Once they separated, Peter shot Doctor Strange a look, and Doctor Strange rolled his eyes slightly as he stepped forward. "Dr. Stephen Strange," he introduced. "I apologize for your earlier treatment. It is nothing personal, but I have an obligation to protect this place." Doctor Strange held out a hand for Danny to shake, as his cloak settled back on his shoulders. Danny faintly noticed his hand shook with delighted tremor and was covered in thin scars as he grippled it. "Danny Fenton," Danny replied back smoothly. "And no problem, I totally get it." It was probably the only thing about this place Danny would understand. If even half of the things he saw were a magical, mystical, as Doctor Strange's cloak, then it would make sense why he was so protective. This place was probably infused with so much energy and manic that it was a little sentient itself, kind of like a ghost lair. And thank you for helping me. Danny smiled, but it dimmed when he felt Peter tense at his side and Dr. Strange grimaced. You're not out of the woods yet, I'm afraid, Dr. Strange remarked, and Danny's breath stuttered. But Danny began, completely stunned, and Peter rubbed at his shoulders. But I feel fine now. Even my core feels better. It's just a little weak right now. We're just treating the symptoms, so to speak, Dr. Strange explained, going back to the shelf and pulling out another book. Unless we find the cause, it's only a matter of time before you go back to how you were. Danny shuddered, holding onto his arms. So, what do we do? Peter intervened, his voice firm. If I can narrow down the type of apparition Danny falls under, then I could find the reason his core is destabilizing, Dr. Strange clarified, distractedly as he searched through the volume of his hand. But I'm having trouble locating a text that references the term Haffa. Unless you have another term I could look for, I'll have to go through each text one by one. There is another option, Wong spoke up behind the table, and all eyes turned to him. Each class of operation has a distinct form that can be observed in the astral plane. Perhaps you could limit your search by looking for the form rather than the name. Dr. Strange snapped the book shut and shoved it back in its slot, rubbing his beard in thought as Danny and Peter shot them questioning looks. What's the astral plane? Danny asked. The astral plane is a parallel dimension where one's soul can exist outside the body, Wong answered promptly, and Danny felt himself pale and beads of sweat form on his brow. Most Master of Mystics arts can project their own spirit into the astral plane, and a few skilled masters are able to push other souls there for a short period of time. Nope. Danny started hysterically, making an attempt to flee the room, but was caught by Peter's ankle strip. Nope. Not doing it. That's a big, fat no from me. I can assure you, Dr. Strange declared comfortingly, astral projection is completely safe. Yeah, maybe for you, Danny countered, hunching deeper into Wade's hoodie. Peter used his strength to gently pull Danny back. Danny, what's wrong? Peter requested softly. You're pale. Danny gawed frantically at his lip. Nothing good ever happens when I'm separated from my body, Danny promised, reminded of the disaster that was the Fenton ghost catcher and how Dan was created. You've astral projected before? Juan inquired, astonished, and Danny shrugged. My ghost's been detached from my body before, but I've never entered a different dimension. Danny clarified, still uneasy about the idea, and Wong and Dr. Strange looked troubled at the news. Danny, entering the astral plane is very different than what you've experienced, Dr. Strange insisted. I promise you, no harm will come to your spirit or your body. Time is relatively slower in the astral planes. That is the mystical realm. You'll only be leaving your body for a few seconds. You promise? Danny asked, weakly, and he hated how he sounded like a child. But he had to be sure. He had to make absolute sure that Dan wouldn't. I swear on my life, in the mystical arts, you won't be hurt. Dr. Strange pleaded resolutely, and Dan waved a quivering breath. All right. Danny consulted, gripping on his sleeves of Wade's hoodie anxiously. How does this work? Dr. Strange led Danny and Peter deeper into the library to another couch. Wong trailed behind them. He gestured for Danny to sit in the middle, and after an additional gesture, Peter sat at his side on the furthest end. Dr. Strange sat on the other end while Wong stood behind the couch. I'm going to put one hand on your shoulder and my other on your chest," Dr. Strange warned, and did so after Danny gave him a quick nod. He pulled the heel of his palm directly over Danny's heart. This might feel a bit odd. Before Danny could reply, Dr. Strange quickly pushed him out of his body, and he fell back as reality folded around him. Dr. Strange quickly followed. Danny's eyes widened as his jaw dropped. It looked and felt as if a film was covering his entire body. Everything was still as time started to crawl, and Danny watched through the thin fabrics of the astral dimension as his body gradually started to shift back into Peter's arms. The room was now covered in mist and trails of energy, some of signatures sparking like distant stars, while others swelled and arched like solar flames. It felt like Danny was swimming in nebula. "My God," Dr. Strange whispered, astonished from behind him, and Danny quickly turned to him. Dr. Strange looked like his body's counterpart and his cloak. He was transparent, as if he was tangible. Danny looked down at himself and understood the sentiment. Instead of being transformed like Doctor Strange, he was oddly solid. Rather than the clothes he wore to the mansion or his phantom jumpsuit, Danny was wearing a dark leather tunic and leggings, with decorative leather braces on his forearms. On his hips, attached to a belt around his waist, was a ethereal sword surrounded by white fire. Around his shoulder was a velvet fur-lined coat, covered in a thin sheet of frost that shimmered like jewels. On his head, floating inches above his hair, rested a familiar crown, glowing in green gossamer energy. And in the center of his chest was a glowing green orb that was surrounded by familiar orange sparkling light. As Danny went to cradle the orb with his hands, he realized with a start that that was his core, and the inner energy that remained of whatever Doctor Strange had done to heal him. Bringing his core up to his face for inspection, Danny noticed something worrying. If he had a physical heart, in this dimension, it would have surely stopped. A small sliver of his core was missing, leaving a gap cracking along the surface. Ectoplasma, leaking slowly from the open sore before caught in the spell Doctor Strange had placed over it. Revelating, the enchantment was making it glow. Danny swallowed. There was a hole in his core. A literal hole on his soul. Doctor Strange must have realized he was starting to panic because he quickly floated to Danny's side. "Time to go," Doctor Strange said, and that was the only warning Danny got before he was pushed out of the astral plane and back into his body. True to Doctor Strange's words, only a few seconds had passed while they were still in the astral plane, and Danny was back in his body before he even landed in Peter's arms. He jolted forward with a harsh exhale, bringing his hands to his chest as he could still cradled his core in his hands. Doctor Strange woke more gently, but instantly jumped off the couch to run back to the rifle through the towers of books left on the table. "Strange," Wong called out, and went to follow him. Meanwhile, Danny rubbed smoothly at Danny's hunched back. "Danny?" Peter questioned worriedly, and Danny shook his head. "I'm all right," Danny whispered. "I just wasn't expecting to see that." "See what?" Peter asked, and Danny shut his eyes. "My core," Danny answered, honestly. There's a crack in my ghost core." Peter paled, dragging Danny off the couch to follow Wong and Doctor Strange. When they returned to the table, Wong was standing off to the side in exploration as Doctor Strange sorted through the piles of books. His cloak was floating by itself again, using its corners like an arm and holding the tomes and journals that Doctor Strange was frantically discarding. "I know what type of apparition Danny is," Doctor Strange insisted as he snatched a leather-bound journal from the stack, read the spine, and tossed it aside for his cloak to catch. He picked up the next book and made a sound of triumph as he started to flip through the pages. The cloak floated and dropped the new stack of books on a free space on the table, zipping back over to Strange and hovering over his shoulders like it was reading along. Danny could barely make out the title along the spine of the tomb through the fancy scripture. Tubularies and other protective aspirations. Danny is a tupulary, Dr. Strange announced as he flipped through more pages, and Danny blinked. Gesundheit, Danny replied back, and Peter nudged his shoulders in expiration, while Dr. Strange sighed and his cloak lifted one of his corners to its collar, like it was face planting. Teenagers, Dr. Strange muddled before turning the book around, showing Peter and Danny what he had found. Danny couldn't read the handwriting, following script, but he studied the pictures in the book. The diagram showed a variety of people who Danny realized were spirits. They appeared to be specters from the different areas of the world, all dressed in drastically different clothes, but they all had a few things in common. Each spirit wore some variant of protective armor, either thick tunics or shields. In their head, or on their hips, was some type of weapon, like a sword or a spear. On their head was a protective ornament, like a crown or a headdress, and they all had orbs of energy somewhere on their body, like their chest, foreheads, or stomachs. A tunic, Dr. Strange explained as he handed the book to Danny, is a guardian spirit or entity that protects a specific place, person, legacy, or culture. Many specters can become tunics if they have strong feelings of protectiveness. So, what does this mean for me? Danny piped up as he handed the book to Peter. Why is there a hole in my core? Dr. Strange frowned. Tunics have anchors, Dr. Strange clarified, a reason for existing that keeps them tethered. Without it, they fade out of existence. Danny finished before he shook his head in denial. An anchor sounded a lot like a ghost obsession. But that doesn't make sense. I've never had an anchor to begin with. Perhaps your anchor was so natural that you didn't notice it, Dr. Strange suggested. But what matters now, right, is fixing your core. Your core is destabilizing because you lost sight of part of your anchor. Re-establishing your anchor in your core will heal itself. Can't you fix it? Danny begged, and Dr. Strange shook his head. This isn't a physical wound I can heal, Dr. Strange stated. It's a spiritual one, and no amount of mystical arts can heal that. The seal I placed on you is simply containing the raw ectoplasm leaking from your core, which is causing the hypothermia. It's not healing you. What happens if I can't find an anchor? Danny asked anxiously, and Dr. Strange flinched. I'm not sure. Dr. Strange answered honestly. If you were full Appalachian, you would eventually fade away. But as a hybrid, one of two things could happen. The first is you simply might lose your powers. The second, if your ghost half is too intertwined with your living half, the shock of your core destabilizing might just kill you. Danny sucked in a terrified breath, and Scordium felt in a grave silence. Somewhere, deep within the ghost zone, a clock continued to tick. Danny has a name! Danny has a label! Everybody clap! Everybody clap! This is a sad, obviously, chapter, because, if he doesn't fix this problem, just, or he just, fades out of existence. I don't know which one's worse. I would rather him lose his powers than him die, but, oh well, the stories are written, and I can't change anything, and I'm not the writer anyway, so I couldn't even change anything. Oh my god, I need to breathe. Jesus. This chapter was so hard to record because I feel really sick right now. It's Thanksgiving. I'm recording this on Thanksgiving. And I'm uploading it on Thanksgiving. I've been doing that a lot lately, recording the day I'm uploading. And today I am super out of breath. I am super duper not feeling well. I think I might be getting sick, but it's not like the fever sick. I don't know what type of sick it is. I just feel ill. I feel unwell. I feel like there's not enough air in my lungs. And sitting here and talking for long extended periods of time was not easy. Even sitting here doing this outro is you could hear that I'm out of breath. Fuck. It's been hard to record today, so I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to pull out a video tomorrow. I genuinely breathe. I'm gonna take a little minute and come back to doing this outro. I'll still try to get Friday's video out, but it's a long one. Let me check how long the chapter for tomorrow will be. Depending on how long it is, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do it. I'm not even sure if I'm going to be able to do the, what's it called? Mockingbird and Lyrebird. To be or to not be. Yeah, it's the same length as this one. Just a little bit longer. Just a little bit longer, just 100 words longer.
Breathe. Echo, breathe.
I'll still try to get it to you guys. Hopefully I wake up better tomorrow, and I'm still gonna try to get Mockingbird and Lyrebird out for later today. But I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to. I'm not sure if I'm gonna try, because it is the special, and I'd feel bad if I didn't. Oh god. Okay. Sorry, I'm feeling very ill. This video was extremely hard to record, and hopefully tomorrow's video won't be that hard to record. This video took me much longer than it should have, because I have, like, every 10 minutes I had to take a break. Because I genuinely, like, started to, like, feel ill and shit. Whew. But hopefully I feel better by tomorrow, and hopefully I can get Mockingbird and Lyrebird out without any issues, and that tomorrow's episode or chapter is also out without any issues. But as always, make sure to eat, sleep, drink water, take your meds, have a wonderful day or night. Join our community Discord server, link is in the description, subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.